A reporter once asked General George S. Patton if he was afraid to die. The question hung in the air. Around them, the war was still grinding forward. Men bleeding in the mud of France, artillery rolling somewhere beyond the tree line, the whole grinding machinery of the largest military campaign in human history. Patton looked at the man with those ice-blue eyes that had unnerved generals and shattered the confidence of enemies across 2 continents. And what he said, what he lived, what he wrote in his diary at midnight when no one was watching, what he roared at 50,000 soldiers on the eve of D-Day, amounted to the most complete answer any American commander ever gave to that question. It was not a single sentence. It was a life. If this channel is where you come for military history that respects the truth and the men who made it, subscribe now and ring that bell. New episodes every week. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born on November 11th, 1885, into a family that had been sending men to war since before the United States was a nation. His grandfather died leading Confederate troops at the Battle of Cedar Creek. His great-uncle fell at Gettysburg. Death in uniform was not an abstraction in the Patton household. It was the family business. From the time he could walk, George Patton understood that soldiers died. What he spent his entire life figuring out was why, and whether the fear of it had to define a man. He was a strange child by any measure. He struggled to read, likely due to dyslexia, and compensated by having everything read aloud to him: history, military biography, ancient poetry. By the time he was a teenager, he had absorbed the campaigns of Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon the way other boys memorized baseball statistics. He didn't just want to be a soldier. He believed, with an almost mystical certainty, that he had been soldiers before, in other wars and other centuries. He wrote poems about it. He believed in reincarnation, in the transmigration of the warrior soul through time. This is not a footnote. It is the foundation of everything that follows. A man who believes he has already died in 100 battles, who believes the soul moves forward through history, wearing different uniforms in different eras, does not fear death the way ordinary men do. For Patton, death was not a wall. It was a door he had already walked through, and walked through again. He entered West Point in 1904, graduated in 1909, and immediately began the lifelong project of becoming the most dangerous man on any battlefield he ever set foot on. He designed the M1913 cavalry saber, still called the Patton saber, because he thought the Army's standard blade was inefficient for killing. He represented the United States in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, finishing 5th overall. He studied fencing in France, personally, from a French master. He was not preparing for a career. He was preparing for war, the one he was certain was coming, the one he believed history had been saving him for. When it came, first in Mexico chasing Pancho Villa in 1916, then on the Western Front in 1917 and 1918, Patton did not hide behind his rank. He went forward. He was wounded leading tanks at the Battle of the Meuse Argonne in 1918, shot through the left thigh, and his men had to drag him out of the line of fire. He lay in the open, directing his tankers, for over an hour before he allowed himself to be evacuated. That moment tells you something essential. The bullet was real. The fear, if it was there, did not move his feet. Between the wars, Patton studied and waited. He studied the German military, their doctrine of fast mechanized warfare, the armored breakthrough tactics that would define the coming conflict. When other officers were managing peacetime budgets and playing golf, Patton was reading. He was never content with what the Army already knew. He wanted to understand war better than the enemy did. He was already 55 years old when Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. Most men at that age are winding down. Patton was just beginning to understand what he was capable of. His rehabilitation of 2 corps in North Africa in 1943 is one of the most remarkable turnarounds in American military history. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced American troops crumpled under German pressure, Patton took command of a broken, demoralized force and in 10 days made them an army again. He didn't do it with encouragement. He did it with discipline, presence, and the absolute refusal to accept the idea that American soldiers couldn't fight. Then came Sicily. Then the slapping incidents. 2 hospitalized soldiers struck by a commanding general who had no tolerance for what he called cowardice, which history now understands as untreated combat trauma. Eisenhower nearly ended Patton's career over it. Many thought it was finished. It wasn't finished. It was just delayed. In the spring of 1944, Patton was given command of the 3rd United States Army, a force composed largely of young men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were green, they were scared, and they were about to be sent into the most ferocious ground campaign in the history of American arms. Patton knew something had to be done. Not paperwork, not briefings, not the cautious, antiseptic leadership he despised in too many of his peers. He had to reach inside these men and find what was already there, the American capacity for violence, for sacrifice, for absolute refusal to quit, and bring it to the surface before the Germans had the chance to bury it. So he spoke to them. Between late May and early June of 1944, in fields and town squares across England, Patton delivered what historians would later call one of the greatest motivational speeches of the entire war. He delivered it from memory, without notes, to audiences of 15,000 men or more, wearing his polished helmet and cavalry boots, gripping a riding crop that he snapped for emphasis. He delivered it 4 to 6 times. Every unit in the Third Army heard some version of it. The speech was never officially transcribed. What survives were written down by soldiers in the audience, from memory, hours after they heard it. That is why different versions exist with slightly different words, but the core never changed. "You are not all going to die," he told them. "Only 2% of you right here today would die in a major battle. Death must not be feared. Death, in time, comes to all men." He paused. He looked at them. Yes, every man is scared in his first battle. If he says he's not, he's a liar. Some men are cowards, but they fight the same as the brave men, or they get the hell slammed out of them watching men fight who are just as scared as they are. Then came the line that cuts through everything. The real hero is the man who fights even though he is scared. Some men get over their fright in a minute under fire. For some, it takes an hour. For some, it takes days. But a real man will never let his fear of death overpower his honor, his sense of duty to his country, and his innate manhood. Read that again. Not a man who feels no fear. Not a man who has conquered fear. A man who feels it, fully, honestly, and fights anyway. This was Patton's answer to the question, not delivered to a reporter in a quiet room, delivered to 50,000 American boys in the mud with the guns of France waiting on the other side of the channel. That same speech contained the line that would define his public image forever. On May 31st, addressing the 6th Armored Division, he opened with a statement that would be quoted for the next 80 years. No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. It was not callousness, it was strategy. Patton had no patience for the romantic idea of noble sacrifice as a goal in itself. Men were not chips to be spent. They were weapons to be aimed. The objective was not death, theirs or the enemy's for its own sake. The objective was victory. Everything else was subordinate. The Third Army activated in Normandy in August 1944 and moved like nothing the European theater had ever seen. While other armies measured progress in miles per week, Patton measured it in miles per day. He crossed the Seine. He drove into Brittany. He closed the Falaise pocket, trapping an entire German army group. He outran his own supply lines and had to stop, not because the Germans could stop him, but because he ran out of gasoline. He was furious about the fuel shortage for the rest of the war. When the German counteroffensive at the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, struck in December 1944 and threatened to collapse the Allied line, it was Patton who answered. In 48 hours, he disengaged 6 divisions from active combat, wheeled them 90 degrees north in the middle of winter, and drove to relieve the siege of Bastogne. Military historians still argue about whether that maneuver has ever been replicated. The men inside Bastogne, surrounded, freezing, nearly out of ammunition, heard his tanks coming on December 26th and wept. He later called it his greatest battle. Through all of it, the artillery, the ambushes, the strafing runs, the freezing nights in open jeeps, Patton was forward, not at headquarters, not behind the wire. forward where the shells landed, where the men could see him, where the war was real and death was not a concept but a smell. His staff begged him to stay back. He refused. He understood something that cannot be taught in any military academy. Soldiers will endure almost anything if they believe their commander is enduring it with them. The presence of the man at the front was not recklessness. It was leadership in its most fundamental form. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton came home to the United States for a brief leave. On June 7th, he stood before a crowd in Boston and spoke words that have been carved into monuments since. It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived. And at a different gathering that same week, in a different register, colder, harder, he said something that cut the romance out of the room entirely. It is a popular idea that a man is a hero just because he was killed in action. Rather, I think, a man is frequently a fool when he gets killed. Both statements are true. They are the same man seen from different angles, the reverence and the severity, the poet and the general. Patton believed in the afterlife. He believed he had already lived through dozens of wars. He wrote late in his life that he approached death the way a professional approaches the end of a long assignment, with some regret, certainly, but without terror. He had done his work. If the moment came, it would come as it always had. There is only one proper way for a professional soldier to die, he said, the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. He did not get that death. On December 9, 1945, his staff car was struck by an army truck on a road outside Mannheim, Germany. The collision was relatively minor, but Patton's neck snapped. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He was 60 years old, lying in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, unable to move, the most aggressive man in the American army, reduced to stillness. He lasted 12 days. He spent them remarkably. He asked for books. He talked with his wife Beatrice, who flew to Germany immediately. He told the doctors at one point that he understood the situation, that a man paralyzed at his age was not going to recover, not in any meaningful sense, and that he was not afraid. He was buried in Luxembourg, at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. He had requested it. He did not want to be separated from his men. There were over 400 American graves in that cemetery when Patton arrived. He knew what each one represented. He had written, after the war, that the sight of military cemeteries was the thing that moved him most deeply. Not pride, not grief exactly, but something closer to obligation. These men had answered the question. They had faced the fear, and they had not let it win. He was placed among them, as he wished. Now, the reporter's question. You understand now why there is no single clean answer, no famous quip that circulated in the newspapers, no recorded moment in a press briefing where Patton looked a journalist in the eye and delivered the perfect line. The question of whether he was afraid to die was not the kind of question Patton answered in one sentence to one reporter. It was the kind of question a man answers with his whole life. He answered it in Sicily when his staff car was strafed and he didn't flinch. He answered it at Kasserine when he walked into a broken army and began rebuilding it from the front. He answered it in the speech before D-Day when he told 50,000 scared young men that every one of them was scared, and that this fact did not matter, not next to honor, not next to duty, not next to the thing a man owes his country and his own sense of himself. He answered it in the Ardennes when he turned an entire army in the dark and drove north into a German breakthrough because that is what was needed and no one else was going to do it. He answered it in Heidelberg in December 1945, lying paralyzed in a hospital bed when the man who had never stopped moving stopped and chose not to be afraid. Fear kills more people than death. That line appears in the records attributed to Patton, and it sounds exactly right. Because what Patton understood from childhood, from everything he read and everything he lived, is that fear is not the enemy. Fear is just the weather. You operate inside it, or you don't operate at all. The real heroes, he said, are the ones who fight even though they're scared. He spent 60 years proving he was one of them. If you've made it to the end of this story, you already know what kind of history matters to you. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who deserves to hear it, and ring that bell, because the next story is already coming, and it is one you will not want to miss. A real man will never let his fear of death overpower his honor, his sense of duty to his country, and his innate manhood. General George S. Patton, Jr., Speech to the Third Army, June 5, 1944.